The Situationist International was an international organization of social revolutionaries made up of avant-garde artists, intellectuals, and political theorists prominent in Europe from its formation in 1957 to its dissolution in 1972. The intellectual foundations of the Situationist International were derived primarily from anti-authoritarian Marxism and the avant-garde art movements of the early 20th century, particularly Dada and Surrealism.Overall, Situationist theory represented an attempt to synthesize this diverse field of theoretical disciplines into a modern and comprehensive critique of mid-20th century advanced capitalism. The Situationists recognized that capitalism had changed since Marx's formative writings, but maintained that his analysis of the capitalist mode of production remained fundamentally correct. They rearticulated and expanded upon several classical Marxist concepts, such as his theory of alienation, in their expanded interpretation of Marxist theory. The Situationists asserted that the misery of social alienation and commodity fetishism were no longer limited to the fundamental components of capitalist society, but had now in advanced capitalism spread themselves to every aspect of life and culture. They rejected the idea that advanced capitalism's apparent successes, such as technological advancement, increased income, and increased leisure, could ever outweigh the social dysfunction and degradation of everyday life that it simultaneously inflicted. Essential to Situationist theory was the concept of the spectacle, a unified critique of advanced capitalism of which a primary concern was the progressively increasing tendency towards the expression and mediation of social relations through objects. The Situationists believed that the shift from individual expression through directly lived experiences, or the first-hand fulfillment of authentic desires, to individual expression by proxy through the exchange or consumption of commodities, or passive second-hand alienation, inflicted significant and far-reaching damage to the quality of human life for both individuals and society. Another important concept of Situationist theory was the primary means of counteracting the spectacle, the construction of situations, moments of life deliberately constructed for the purpose of reawakening and pursuing authentic desires, experiencing the feeling of life and adventure, and the liberation of everyday life. When the Situationist International was first formed, it had a predominantly artistic focus. Emphasis was placed on concepts like unitary urbanism and psychogeography. Gradually, however, that focus shifted more towards revolutionary and political theory. The Situationist International reached the apex of its creative output and influence in 1967 and 1968, with the former marking the publication of the two most significant texts of the Situationist movement, The Society of the Spectacle by Guy Debord and The Revolution of Everyday Life by Raoul van Eigen. The expressed writing and political theory of the two aforementioned texts, along with other Situationist publications, proved greatly influential in shaping the ideas behind the May 1968 insurrections in France. Quotes, phrases, and slogans from Situationist texts and publications were ubiquitous on posters and graffiti throughout France during the uprisings. Etymology in usage. The term situationist refers to the construction of situations, one of the early central concepts of the Situationist International. The term also refers to any individuals engaged in the construction of situations, or, more narrowly, to members of the Situationist International. Situationist theory sees the situation as a tool for the liberation of everyday life. a method of negating the pervasive alienation that accompanied the spectacle. The founding manifesto of the Situationist International report on the construction of situations defined the construction of situations as the concrete construction of momentary ambiances of life and the transformation into a superior, passional quality. International Situationists No. 1 defined the constructed situation as a moment of life concretely and deliberately constructed by the collective organization of a unitary ambience and a game of events. The Situationists argued that advanced capitalism manufactured false desires, literally in the sense of ubiquitous advertising and the glorification of accumulated capital, and more broadly in the abstraction and reification of the more ephemeral experiences of authentic life into commodities. The experimental direction of situationist activity consisted of setting up temporary environments favorable to the fulfillment of true and authentic human desires in response. The Situationist International strongly resisted use of the term situationism, which Debord called a meaningless term, adding, "Here is no such thing as situationism," which would mean a doctrine for interpreting existing conditions. The Situationists maintained a philosophical opposition to all ideologies, conceiving of them as abstract superstructures ultimately serving only to justify the economic base of a given society. Accordingly, they rejected situationism as an absurd and self-contradictory concept. In the society of the spectacle, Debord asserted ideology was the abstract will to universality and the illusion thereof, which was legitimated in modern society by universal abstraction and by the effective dictatorship of illusion. However, despite their insistence on this point, the term situationism is still occasionally used in reference to the Situationist International. History. Origins. The Situationist movement had its origins as a left-wing tendency within lettrism, an artistic and literary movement led by the Romanian-born French poet and visual artist Isidore Isau, originating in 1940s Paris. The group was heavily influenced by the preceding avant-garde movements of Dadaism and Surrealism, seeking to apply critical theories based on these concepts to all areas of art and culture, most notably in poetry, film, painting and political theory. Among some of the concepts and artistic innovations developed by the lettrists were the lettre, a poem reflecting pure form yet devoid of all semantic content, new syntheses of writing and visual art identified as metagraphics and hypergraphics, as well as new creative techniques in filmmaking. Future situationist Guy Debord, who was at the time a significant figure in the lettrist movement, helped develop these new film techniques, using them in his lettrist film Howls for Sade as well as later in his situationist films Society of the Spectacle. By 1950, a much younger and more left-wing part of the lettrist movement began to emerge. This group kept very active in perpetrating public outrages such as the Notre Dame affair, where at the Easter High Mass at Notre Dame de Paris, in front of 10,000 people and broadcast on national TV, the member and former Dominican Michel Moore, posed as a monk, stood in front of the altar and read a pamphlet proclaiming that God was dead. André Breton prominently came out in solidarity with the action in a letter that spawned a large debate in the newspaper Combat. In 1952, this left wing of the lettrist movement, which included Debord, broke off from Isau's group and formed the Lettrist International, a new Paris-based collective of avant-garde artists and political theorists. The schism finally erupted when the future members of the radical lettrists disrupted a Charlie Chaplin press conference for Limelight at the Hotel Ritz Paris. They distributed a polemic entitled "No More Flat Feet," which concluded, "The footlights have melted the makeup of the supposedly brilliant mime. All we can see now is a lugubrious and mercenary old man." "Go home, Mr. Chaplin." Isao was upset with this, his own attitude being that Chaplin deserved respect as one of the great creators of the cinematic art. The breakaway group felt that his work was no longer relevant, while having appreciated it in its own time, and asserted the belief that the most urgent expression of freedom is the destruction of idols, especially when they claim to represent freedom. In this case, filmmaker Charlie Chaplin. During this period of the Letterist International, many of the important concepts and ideas that would later be integral in situationist theory were developed. Individuals in the group collaboratively constructed the new field of psychogeography, which they defined as the study of the specific effects of the geographical environment on the emotions and behavior of individuals. Debord further expanded this concept of psychogeography with his theory of the derived, an unplanned tour through an urban landscape directed entirely by the feelings evoked in the individual by the surroundings, serving as the primary means for mapping and investigating the psychogeography of these different areas. During this period, the Letterist International also developed the situationist tactic of détournement, which, by reworking or recontextualizing an existing work of art or literature, sought to radically shift its meaning to one with revolutionary significance. Formation. In 1956, members of the Letterist International made contact with several different artistic collectives at the First World Congress of Free Artists in Alba, Italy, finding significant common ground politically and philosophically. In July 1957, the Situationist International was established with the fusion of several of these extremely small avant-garde artistic tendencies. The Letterist International, the International Movement for an Imaginist Bauhaus, and the London Psychogeographical Association. Later, the Situationist International drew ideas from other groups such as Socialisme.The. The most prominent member of the group, Guy Debord, generally became considered the organization's de facto leader and most distinguished theorist. Other members included theorist Raoul van Eyck, the Dutch painter Constant Nieuwenhuis, the Italo-Scottish writer Alexander Trocchi, the English artist Ralph Rumney, the Danish artist Asger Jorn, the architect and veteran of the Hungarian uprising Attila Kotani, and the French writer Michel Bernstein. Debord and Bernstein later married. During the first 4 years from its formation, the pivot of the Situationist International was the collaboration between Guy Debord and Asger Jorn. In June 1957, Debord read the manifesto of the Situationist International, titled Report on the Construction of Situations. This manifesto plans a systematic rereading of Karl Marx's Das Kapital and advocates a cultural revolution in Western countries. Artistic period. During the first few years of the SI's founding, avant-garde artistic groups began collaborating with the SI and joining the organization. Gruppes per, a German artistic collective, collaborated with the Situationist International on projects beginning in 1959, continuing until the group officially joined the SI in 1961. The role of the artists in the SI was of great significance, particularly Asger Jorn, Constant Nieuwenhuis and Pino Galizio. Asger Jorn, who invented situography and situology, had the social role of catalyst and team leader among the members of the SI between 1957 and 1961. Jorn's role in the situationist movement was that of a catalyst and team leader. Guy Debord on his own lacked the personal warmth and persuasiveness to draw people of different nationalities and talents into an active working partnership. As a prototype Marxist intellectual, Debord needed an ally who could patch up the petty egoisms and squabbles of the members. When John's leadership was withdrawn in 1961, many simmering quarrels among different sections of the SI flared up, leading to multiple exclusions. The first major split was the exclusion of Grappi's per, the German section, for the SI on February 10, 1962. Many different disagreements led to the fracture. For example, while at the Fourth SI Conference in London in December 1960, in a discussion about the political nature of the SI, the Grappi's per members disagreed with the core situationist stance of counting on a revolutionary proletariat, the accusation that their activities were based on a systematic misunderstanding of situationist theses, the understanding that at least one Grappi's per member, sculptor Lothar Fischer, and possibly the rest of the group, were not actually understanding and or agreeing with the situationist ideas, but were just using the SI to achieve success in the art market. The betrayal in the Spur No. 7 issue of a common agreement on the Grappi's per and SI publications. The exclusion was a recognition that Grappi SPUR's principles, methods and goals were significantly in contrast with those of the SI. This split, however, was not a declaration of hostilities, as in other cases of SI exclusions. A few months after the exclusion, in the context of judicial prosecution against the group by the German state, Debord expressed his esteem to Grappi's per, calling it the only significant artist group in Germany since World War II, and regarding it at the level of the avant-gardes in other countries. The next significant split was in 1962, wherein the Naschists, the Scandinavian section of the SI led by Jürgen Nash, were excluded from the organization for lacking the theoretical rigor demanded by the Franco-Belgian section of SI led by Guy Debord. This excluded group would later declare themselves the Second Situationist International, basing their organization out of Sweden. Journalist Stuart Home, who favored the Naschists and considered Debord a mystic, an idealist, a dogmatist and a liar, wrote that while the Second Situationist International sought to challenge the separation of art and politics from everyday life, Debord and the so-called specto-situationists sought to concentrate solely on theoretical political aims. Political period. By this point the Situationist International consisted almost exclusively of the Franco-Belgian section, led by Guy Debord and Raoul van Eygen. These members possessed much more of a tendency towards political theory over the more artistic aspects of the SI. The shift in the intellectual priorities within the SI resulted in more focus on the theoretical, such as the theory of the spectacle and Marxist critical analysis, spending much less time on the more artistic and tangible concepts like unitary urbanism, détournement, and psychogeography. During this period the SI began having more and more influence on local university students in France, taking advantage of the apathy of the colleagues. 5 Procitis, situationist influence students, infiltrated the University of Strasbourg's student union in November 1966 and began scandalizing the authorities. The first action was to form an anarchist appreciation society, called the Society for the Rehabilitation for Karl Marx and Ravachol. Next, they appropriated union funds to fly post return of the Durruti column, André Bertrand's détourné comic strip. They then invited the Situationists to contribute a critique of the University of Strasbourg and on the poverty of student life. Written by Tunisian Situationist Mustafa Omar Kayati was the result. The students promptly proceeded to print 10,000 copies of the pamphlet using university funds and distributed them during a ceremony marking the beginning of the academic year. This provoked an immediate outcry in the local, national and international media. May events. The Situationists played a preponderant role in the May 1968 uprisings, and to some extent the political perspective and ideas fueled such crisis, providing a central theoretic foundation. While SI's member count had been steadily falling for the preceding several years, the ones that remained were able to fill revolutionary roles for which they had patiently anticipated and prepared. The active ideologists behind the revolutionary events in Strasbourg, Nanterre and Paris numbered only about 1 or 2 dozen persons. This has now been widely acknowledged as a fact by studies of the period. What is still wide open to interpretation is the how and why that happened. Charles de Gaulle, in the aftermath televised speech of June 7, acknowledged that this explosion was provoked by groups in revolt against modern consumer and technical society, whether it be the communism of the East or the capitalism of the West. They also made up the majority in the Occupation Committee of the Sorbonne. An important event leading up to May 1968 was the scandal in Strasbourg in December 1966. The Union Nationale des Étudiants de France declared itself in favor of the SI's thesis, and managed to use public funds to publish Mustafa Kayuti's pamphlet on the poverty of student life. Thousands of copies of the pamphlet were printed and circulated and helped to make the Situationists well known throughout the non-Stalinist left. Quotations from 2 key Situationist books, Deboard's The Society of the Spectacle and Kayuti's On the Poverty of Student Life, were written on the walls of Paris and several provincial cities. This was documented in the collection of photographs published in 1968 by Walter Lewino, L'Imagination au pouvoir. Those who followed the artistic view of the SI might view the evolution of the SI as producing a more boring or dogmatic organization. Those following the political view would see the May 1968 uprisings as a logical outcome of the SI's dialectical approach. While savaging present-day society, they sought a revolutionary society which would embody the positive tendencies of capitalist development. The realization and suppression of art is simply the most developed of the many dialectical supersessions which the SI sought over the years. For the Situationist International of 1968, the world triumph of workers' councils would bring about all these supersessions. Though the SI were a very small group, they were expert self-propagandists, and the slogans appeared daubed on walls throughout Paris at the time of the revolt. SI member René Vionet's 1968 book Enrages and Situationists in the Occupations Movement, France, May 68, gives an account of the involvement of the SI with the student group of Enrages and the occupation of the Sorbonne. The occupations of 1968 started at the University of Nanterre and spread to the Sorbonne. The police tried to take back the Sorbonne and a riot ensued. Following this, a general strike was declared with up to 10 million workers participating. The SI originally participated in the Sorbonne occupations and defended barricades in the riots. The SI distributed calls for the occupation of factories and the formation of workers' councils, but, disillusioned with the students, left the university to set up the Council for the Maintenance of the Occupations, which distributed the SI's demands on a much wider scale. After the end of the movement, the CMDO disbanded. Aftermath. By 1972, Gianfranco Sanguinetti and Guy Debord were the only 2 remaining members of the SI. Working with Debord, in August 1975, Sanguinetti wrote a pamphlet titled Rapport veridico sulla ultima opportunità di salvare il capitalismo in Italia. which purported to be the cynical writing of censor, a powerful industrialist. The pamphlet argued that the ruling class of Italy supported the Piazza Fontana bombing and other covert, false flag mass slaughter for the higher goal of defending the capitalist status quo from communist influence. The pamphlet was mailed to 520 of Italy's most powerful individuals. It was received as genuine, and powerful politicians, industrialists and journalists praised its content. After reprinting the tract as a small book, Sanguinetti revealed himself to be the true author. In the outcry that ensued and under pressure from Italian authorities, Sanguinetti left Italy in February 1976, and was denied entry to France. After publishing in the last issue of the magazine an analysis of the May 1968 revolts, and the strategies that will need to be adopted in future revolutions, the SI was dissolved in 1972.